Joeri, take it away.
Thanks so much, Magali, for this super introduction. And good morning to everyone, or wherever you are in the world. Good day to you. We will talk about the European results of our latest conscious consumption study, as Magali has already mentioned. And to make it a bit more interactive, I'd like to use this polling tool, for which you need to scan the QR code that is now on the screen. To make sure that it works, I will do the same. So use your mobile phone, for instance, and scan the QR codes. If you don't know how to do it, that's just your Cam app normally, which will open a link, and that's the URL that's also mentioned on the bottom of the slide if you're not using your Cam app, pollev.com/my first name, Joeri. And if you do that and you accept some cookies in the morning, then you will normally come to the first page where you can already indicate how you are feeling today. And I hope you're feeling very good. In the meantime, while you are voting, I can explain you a bit about the study for the research nerds. I would say we did field in 6 European countries that are mentioned below. So a total sample of 2,412 15 to 70-year-olds in Europe. For the record, we are including the UK in Europe, so it's not the European Union, it's Europe. We still include our UK country in this average results, as we have offices in London and Manchester, as Magali has mentioned. And we will compare these with the same sample, or kind of the same sample we did last year in July 2019. Maybe some of you saw the results of that one. Why did we do it? Of course, because we wanted to compare what has happened to the topic of sustainability since another thing that happened this year, COVID-19. So in the meantime, let's see if you're voting on the first question on how you're feeling. I see some of the votes are in the green smileys, so that's great. If you just turn up, you can still participate, because I will ask some more questions throughout the presentation. You can still participate in this polling by scanning the QR code you see on the top of the screen every time, or just once, and it will guide you through the questions of the poll, or by going to the URL, which is also on the top of the screen, pollev.com/Joeri. So most of you are still voting in the green, this one in neutral, as I can see. So maybe some of you are feeling a bit eco-anxious. Eco-anxiety is a new form of anxiety that was actually defined by psychologists as a worry about the environmental crisis, and more specifically also the anxiety that maybe we cannot solve it. Maybe we cannot solve climate change, and it leads to identifiable symptoms like panic attacks, obsessive thinking, loss of appetite, and insomnia. And it's also sometimes related to the frustration that local government is not doing enough to limit climate change, which is often the case because climate change is politicized, as they call it. Some left-wing parties are using it, some right-wing parties are using it in a different way, which in the end will lead to government not really taking enough actions. And that leads to eco-anxiety. It also leads to some step further, you could say, from worrying to worrying. And we saw the climate protests already happening, specifically in 2019, when we weren't in a lockdown yet. There were, of course, the students skipping school on Thursdays or on Fridays internationally. There was the international climate protests end of September 2019, with 7.5 million people worldwide going on the streets, including Microsoft employees and Amazon employees, to protest that their companies were not doing enough even for the climate. And it's not just the youngest ones, or the influencers, you could say, but it's also the older generation. And then I'm thinking of David Attenborough, who is really also influencer with the kind of documentaries he's making. I'm not sure if you've seen his latest work, which is a testimony, you could call it, of his life. He explains what he saw throughout his 94 years of living on this planet, a life on our planet. And if you haven't seen it, I can highly recommend it. He also, or the team behind David Attenborough, started an Instagram page profile for the first time, actually, on the age of 94, which immediately led to millions. By now it's over 6 million followers worldwide. So you have the youngest, Gen Z, influencing with student protests, but you also have the oldest, 94-year-old David Attenborough, who is still influencing more eco-conscious behavior. But because in the end, we're all living on the same planet and we all want to make the world greater again. Now, maybe because of that thing, terrible thing that happened to us this year and at the end of last year in Asia, COVID-19, perhaps people want to make the world more safe again instead of greater again. Many people said we're not hearing anything about climate protests anymore. What happened to Greta Thunberg? Is she still there? Yes, she is. And Gen Z is still protesting online on social media, which is often not mentioned in the news. But because of this virus, some people uttered maybe clean is the new green. So maybe consumers today are more worrying about safety, hygiene, and not becoming infected. And of course, at first, that was the first reaction to this health crisis. Another thing that can happen is instead of making the world more eco-conscious, is make it more fun again, because with all the shops closed, with restaurants closed, clubs closed, traveling becoming impossible, what's there to have fun anymore in the world? And let's have a look again at how you were voting. And you see some of you are maybe eco-conscious or are not having fun or fed up with lockdowns, fed up working remotely. I'm glad that most of you that are participating in this session today are still in the green of this smileys. Now, if we asked our European consumers how important is sustainability to you today, and we asked it again in October 2020 and compared it to July 2019, we see luckily that it hasn't been decreasing. It's 84% of European consumers, with the British being the most skeptical, you could say, or relatively attaching less importance to sustainability. It's still 78%. And other countries like France and Germany finding sustainability very important. But 84% compared to 81%, so it is a slight increase with an error margin of 2% on this sample size. We also directly asked people, to what extent is climate change to you an important issue? Because we used to have this neglectors of climate change or the disbelievers of climate change. Today, 3 out of 4 mainstream consumers, 15 to 70 years old, is saying it is an important issue. So that there is still maybe a smart part of the population that's not believing it, but the majority clearly is 3/4. 2 out of 3 are also saying it is as serious as the current COVID-19 crisis, which is quite important. And it's also true, not only if you look at Life on Our Planet, the David Attenborough testimony, but also if you look at Earth Overshoot Day. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Earth Overshoot Day, but it's the day on which we've used up all the natural resources that the planet is giving us, which means that from that day on, we're destructing the planet. It leads to deforestation, CO2 emissions that cannot be offset anymore, that cannot be solved anymore by the planet. And as you can see on this graph, the Earth Overshoot Day in the 25 past years, it has become earlier and earlier in the calendar year, which means that we're destructing the planet even more. Despite UN definitions of sustainability in 1987, UN goals a bit later, but also despite the triple bottom line reports, which I will mention later on, we see that it comes earlier every year. The maybe a silver lining of the COVID-19 crisis is that Earth Overshoot Day this year was almost 1 month earlier than the previous years because of the lockdowns, because there was less oil productions, a crisis. But still, it's August 22, which means on a global scale, we still need 1.6 planets. So we don't have enough with one planet in these extreme circumstances in which we have several lockdowns in most countries around the world. So this also led to more eco-anxiety because it means that it's not so easy to solve. So the usual way how we look at sustainability, doing less harm to the planet and to people, that won't be enough. And it's also, I think, the message that David Attenborough is bringing in life on our planet. The classic model that we have been using on sustainability and CSR, created by John Elkington 26 years ago, which says sustainability is defined as we're doing better for the planet, better for people, but also better for our profits. This model is not working anymore. And John Elkington himself, as a thought leader, recalled this model last year in 2019. And that's quite extraordinary. It's normally car manufacturers who are recalling their model because the brakes are not working, which is really a good reason to recall a model. But a thought leader recalling his model, saying, I was wrong, that is exceptional. And maybe he said this model it's wrong because he wrote a new book, of course, as a thought leader called Green Swans, and I'm sure you've heard about black swans and grey rhinos. But Green Swans is the new book of John Elkington, in which he said my model was wrong in a sense that I said it should be better for everything, including profits, which gave companies in the past 25 years an alibi not to innovate in sustainable alternatives if they didn't lead to more profits. Even if it led to the same amount of profits, they said, yeah, but in the definition it says better for the profits. Or if it led to a lower EBITDA in the short run, but in the long term, a better financial performance, they still said, but it's worse for our EBITDA in the short run. So let's not implement this new way of producing or introduce this new product in the market. Now, what he says in Green Swans is, I was wrong. We should be thinking about doing things in a different way to actually restore and replenish the natural resources, the ones that we've been using up in the past 25 years. And that means rethinking our systems, our products, even if they're relevant enough to produce. Aren't we promoting overconsumption by launching certain products that don't really add value? We should question that. But also the way that businesses are organized, the way that people are living, and the way that we as companies are working or not working together with our competitors. So one of the things he says is we cannot solve the climate change is if every company is working on ESG, environmental and social governance, on its own. That won't solve the crisis. We have to cooperate because the problem is, the issue is too big. We need to empower everyone to work together. And luckily, we're already seeing some initiatives like the Loop projects, which is a combination of TerraCycle, recycling organization, working together with 25 big multinationals, many of them competitors like Procter & Gamble, Unilever, Mars, Nestle, all working together with UPS as a delivery service to bring and pick up in the circular system durable containers of products from the consumer back to the factory, which is the milkman principle, as you could call it. Also mentioned it's regenerative, so it means it should add something back to the planet rather than stealing something from the planet. So we also call this climate plus commerce. And what we saw in our results is that 2/3 of Europeans are concerned about wasting the natural resources for the moment. So one of the ways of doing that is reorganizing business parks or reorganizing how businesses are working together. A great example we find in Denmark, in the Nordics, in Kalundborg, where 9 businesses are working together in a circular system, which means they're using each other's waste, byproducts of their production, materials, but also the energy surplus that some of the companies are creating is used by other companies. In the end, it leads to carbon negative, carbon negative emission instead of just being carbon neutral. So climate positive thinking. Also, the way people are living should change. This is an example from the Netherlands, the regen villages, which they're building right now in Almere, 1.5 hour of commuting to Utrecht in the Netherlands. As you can see, these are self-sustaining villages, communities, where they are using renewable energy, solar power, but also growing their own vegetables, their own fish. They are reusing their wastewater, but also even their food waste is giving us food to the fish in the rivers, so that it really becomes a circular system. And of course, you cannot drive a fossil fuel car if you want to live in this regen village. So what we were talking about until now was what is sustainability today. It was the triple bottom line model, but actually it should become more climate plus, adding instead of taking from the planet. But what does sustainability actually mean to consumers? And if you go back to your poll everywhere on your mobile phone, you will find the open-ended question asking you, what do consumers understand by sustainability? And if you use one word, we will see this in this word cloud popping up. You can already see people answering with one word. So not in your head, but what do you think in the head of mainstream European consumers is sustainability to them? Plastic-free, green, recycling. We'll come back to some more answers later on. Keep voting and keep adding your idea of what that sustainability could mean to consumers. What we see in qualitative research and what the typical definition of sustainability, it often focuses on the mid of this slide, which is all about environmental responsibility. So doing things that are better for the planet, which means responsible sourcing and production, reducing, reusing, recycling, repairing, restoring, that type of things, less CO2 emissions, less transport. That's typically something that many people see as the definition of sustainability. But there's other aspects to the right, for instance. It's more on the aspect of it's better for myself, for my health, or for the health of others, which means it's free from chemicals, it's natural, it's bio, there's less sugar and fat. And to the left side, it's more about, it's an ethical and fair business. So it's about fair wages, but also diversity, inclusivity, giving back to community, the social aspect, you could say, of ESG strategies. Now, there's a lot on this one slide, and what we know from our consumers is they often confuse organic, sustainable, and fair trade, which means if they see bio vegetables packed in plastics, it kind of conflicts in their head, because to them it's one holistic concept. And something that's made fair trade is not always organic or the other way around, and is not per definition also produced in a sustainable way. Now, to summarize the previous slide in something more comprehensible, I took an example of a category that has been proven to be crucial to mankind in the past months of the corona crisis, toilet paper. And there's this great example of a luxury premium toilet paper brand in Australia called Who Gives a Crap. It's DTC, direct to consumer toilet paper. And you see that they use the same three aspects. It's good for the world, so it's environmental responsible. They're even B Corp certified. We can come back to that later on. It's also good for your own bum, which is a peach, I think, in this case, quite hairy bum, because they're not using any inks or chemicals. So it's better for your skin, you could say. But the real differentiator from competition is we're doing good for people. So actually the social cause. And what I say is there's more people worldwide who don't have access to clean toilets than there's people who have access to a mobile phone, which is really harmful for the health of people. So they're donating half of all the profits to charities that are building toilets in emerging and developing markets, which is something that I haven't seen with other toilet paper brands. Good for the world, using FSC, Forest Stewardship Council certified paper coming from managed forest, for instance, or recycled paper. I've seen that before, being better for your bum, for your own health, not using chemicals. In some regions, you will say, okay, I've seen that with other brands as well. So we can call that defensive shields, whereas in this case, donating half of your profit is really a competitive advantage. So these are two complementary brand strategies. On one hand, you should look at what are companies doing in my industry and what is becoming the best practice, because if you're not implementing that, you risk of not only getting boycotted by consumers, but also NGOs reacting, and you are on the risk of losing relevance to consumers. So it's a defensive shield. On the other hand, to really have benefits from using sustainability in your innovations and in your brand strategies, we should also look for differentiating aspects of our ESG strategies. Now let's have a look back on your word cloud, which has grown a lot, as you can see in the meantime. And the words that are the biggest are the ones that were used the most by you. And as you can see, it's also related to that environmental responsibility, waste, green, plastic, planet, recycling. Maybe good is the more social aspect, and it goes more to the left side of the overview that I've shown you. Also seen children, labor, for instance, that's also the left side. Some of you have also said it's healthy, it's safe, so that's more better for your health. So you see the three aspects are there. Now, if you ask this question to our Europeans in the survey, these were the results, and we're comparing here the 2020 results of October, very fresh field, you could say, in golden bars. And the green ones are the ones of July 2019. And we see that one that has been growing fast and is now the #1 is reducing CO2 emissions, but also restoring, replenishing nature is still in the top 5, and preserving biospheres that they haven't been growing during the past 15 months, but they're still in the top 10. And all of three of them, you could say, could be related not only to the progress of 15 months, but also to the lockdowns. And one thing that's for sure is that because of the lockdowns, people revalued nature again and the importance of having clean air. There were people living in cities that said, I can feel the effect of the lockdown on the air quality in my city, and it should be like this all the time, which means we should avoid having fossil fuel cars in our cities. So this is changing consumer and citizen sentiment as a result of the COVID-19 lockdowns and people living more at home and feeling the difference in the clean air. A funny difference and result was it's 57%, as you can see in general on GenPop in Europe. When we looked to the women in Europe, it was even 66%. So women value nature and the importance of clean air more than men. I'm not sure why. Maybe they were happy to leave their stinky husband at home and go for a walk with their friends. Or maybe they're just more sportive and they went for a run when guys were treating a lockdown by drinking more wines, sitting in their chairs. So these are just hypotheses. But CO2 emissions, as you can see, it was growing with 10%, grew with 10%. So it becomes more important in your marketing campaign as well. There is CO2 in the air. We already are seeing that certain brands in different categories are using this claim carbon footprint and CO2 emission as a new currency. And for instance, Ford in the automotive, which has hybrid vans, introduced a new geofencing plug that is pushing their hybrid vans into using the electric energy, the battery, instead of the fossil fuel whenever the van is entering a low emission zone, so city center often, or even sensitive areas, just like schools, hospitals, etc. Even in FMCG, we see brands like Oatly, the oat milk dairy alternative, that is campaigning about saving CO2 emissions by switching from cow milk to a plant-based alternative. not only in their campaigns, but even on pack, they're printing their carbon footprint, so more transparency on that. And of course, challenging competitors to show their numbers, as they know that cow milk with all the methane gases coming from the cows will have worse results if they have to publish it. The same we see with meat replacers like corn, for instance, comparing their own carbon footprint to other things in your shopping basket. And as you can see, they are the best thing that you can buy in the shopping basket when it comes to CO2 emissions. Even in the finance industry, we increasingly see that banks are more involved with green bonds and sustainable investments, but also credit cards like MasterCard, working together with the Swedish economy, has created this credit card that gives an overview of your CO2 emissions of everything you have bought in the past month on your monthly overview, and also giving suggestions where you normally get discounts on certain products. They give suggestions on buying more sustainable alternatives that lead to less CO2 emissions. They've also introduced this black card, and the black card is setting a limit on your carbon emissions that month. Instead of a financial limit, it denies transactions if you've reached a certain CO2 emission personally that month. So that's the part about CO2 emissions. Number two, as you can see in the top of mind sustainability brain of the consumer, is recycling programs, which has also been growing slightly since COVID-19, because we're more at home. We see the amount of waste that we are collecting. And some brands like Nespresso, a Nestle brand, for instance, is today actively doing advertising, targeting people to say, listen, we use aluminium. Aluminium is 100% recyclable. It is protecting the quality of your coffee. But there's one thing: to make it 100% recyclable, you should recycle it in the right way. And you cannot throw it away with the rest of your waste, or in nature, even worse. But we have green bags to recollect our aluminium, and we have drop-off points not only in Nespresso boutiques, but also in a shop near you. You can find them online. Now, to promote this sustainable behavior and recycling, they are creating products with the recycled capsules. And you can see the bike here is one of the 1,000 limited editions bikes that they've created together with a Swedish startup called Philosophy. It's made, the 1,000 bikes are made of 300,000 arpeggio capsules, the purple ones, and they're used in a contest among people who are recycling the capsules. They also created these pens with Carandash, which is a famous Swiss stationery brand, Swiss like Nespresso. And this one is made from one arpeggio capsule. And this is only a way to show if you recycle, we are upcycling it, but we're also reusing it in our capsules, which are by now 80% already made from recycled aluminium, but we want to go for 100%, and therefore we need your help. On the third spot, in associations with sustainability in the consumer's mind, is everything that has to do with plastics, virgin plastics, single-use plastics, and reducing the amount of packaging. And again, it's of course because the retailers, and we see that in our results as well, if you ask people spontaneously what are sustainable brands, almost half of the brands they're naming are retailers, like Tesco, for instance, or Coop, or ICA, ICA in Sweden, or Albert Heijn, and name them, or Edeka, etc. in Germany. So the retailers are quite dominant in the space of communicating about sustainability, and they all have this practice of removing plastics from their offerings and their assortment, which leads to, in the end, their clients, our clients as well, multinationals that have to invest in their R&D funnel on replacing plastics in packaging. And Nestle, for instance, started this Institute of Packaging Sciences, which has 50 full-time researchers that are continuously looking for alternatives for plastics in packaging. And they've already introduced in less than 1 year for 3 different brands a paper alternative that is still keeping the quality of the product, of the Nestlé products. When looking back at this list, again, one conclusion is that the top of mind associations are often environmentally responsible. And there's also within the top 10 some things like no pesticides on vegetables, no chemicals in productions that are more about it's better for my own health. And then the social aspects are lower in the top of mind associations. But when we look at what is really important to you when it comes to buying products, we see that certain aspects like animal welfare, cruelty-free, for instance, are more important. And of course, that's related to certain categories like personal care, for instance. But also another conclusion is that there are some differences between generations. And when we look at the youngest generation, we see that they are putting more importance on fair wages and fair trade. That they're, of course, also more involved with gender equality and LGBT rights, but also race equality. So more the social aspects are more important to the younger generation. So to summarize this first part, we talked about triple bottom line replaced by Climate Plus, the meaning of sustainability to European consumers. It's a holistic concept. Environmental responsibility is on top of mind, but when it comes to buying decisions, also social aspects become more important and health aspects, especially for categories that are on me, like cosmetics, or in me, like food and beverages. And there's 2 different brand strategies that are important. The first one is a defensive shield, so actually best practices in the industry to make sure you stay relevant, but also finding sustainability programs that are really differentiating from competitors. Now, to find the right mission and to find this combination of addressing what is playing in your industry and what is becoming more important, what is a defensive shield and what is still differentiating, this implies that you have to use a certain decision frame. And this decision frame has 5 components, and most of those components are not internal, where often companies tend to make decisions on sustainability quite internal. If you look at it, the most important critical success factor of implementing a sustainability strategy is there a fit in the mind of the consumer between your brand, your company, and what you're doing on sustainability. If they don't see a fit, then you risk being seen as a greenwashing company. So having a clear fit with your DNA, why us, that is quite important. And it's not in your head, it's in the head of the consumer. The brand strategies, sustainable strategies and claims that you're making, are these all relevant for your markets that are relevant to you? Are they claimable? Do we really have strengths in that area? Are we better than our competitors? Again, that's your license to play, and it's in the head of the consumers. But also, are they engaging enough? Are they campaignable with our consumers? Again, this involves testing with your consumers. So not internal, but external decisions. And it's not only on insights on what mainstream consumers are thinking today, because if you think of competitive advantages and not just defensive shields, we should also listen to leading edge consumers and have a look at foresights. What will be important when it comes to sustainability tomorrow? So let's have a first look on what mainstream consumers are doing themselves when it comes to living more ethically, living more consciously, living more sustainably. And what we saw in our latest results is that 6 out of 10 Europeans, they want to change their own habits to support sustainability. Now, there's different ways of doing that, and that's the next question you will find in your poll. You have 3 options actually, and I'm asking you, which of these 3 options do you think are the most popular among consumers? Is it using up the leftovers at home in the fridge? Is it limiting water use, meaning I'm stopping the tap while I'm taking a shower and washing my hair? Or is it refusing the plastic bags in the shops? So 3 options: using up leftovers, limiting water usage, or refusing plastic bags. Please offer your votes to our poll everywhere. Some first facts while you're voting on how conscious is the European consumer. half of the Europeans is saying, I am living sustainably, and only 16% says the opposite, which means there's a lot of neutrals of which we can expect that they're not living that sustainable. We also, again, see differences within generations, with women living a bit more sustainable than men, but also what we see is that baby boomers and Gen X are also living less sustainable than the younger generations. And millennials are the ones that are making the fastest progress for the moment, maybe because they are increasingly becoming parents of kids. They're the new parents, and they want their kids to live on a planet that is still a good planet, of course, in the end. Another conclusion is that 7 out of 10 people is willing to pay more for a sustainable alternative, and it depends on for which category they want to pay more. But on the other hand, 2/3 in another question also says, but we didn't create a problem. It's actually the companies who are creating certain packages or using certain chemicals or ingredients or ways of production that leads to CO2 emission. So why should we have to pay for more sustainable alternatives? Let's have this efforts and price done at the side of companies or even the government, but not me as a consumer. Plastics are still a demon. We already saw that in the results of spontaneous associations, virgin plastics, single-use plastics, using those. Well, it's not something that consumers are still accepting, which means that certain categories that were depending on using plastics really have to rethink the way that they're producing or packaging their products. And one great example is how Coca-Cola is switching from or to recycled PET in the end. In Europe, for instance, they are already capable of producing the small bottles in Sweden, Norway, and the Netherlands, made completely from 100% recycled PET plastics, so no virgin plastics anymore. And by next year, 2021, also the big bottles will be made from recycled PET in the end. Let's have a look back on the results of what you think were the most, or are still the most popular consumer habits. And if I look at your results, 6 out of 10 have voted that what people are doing the most is refusing plastic bags in shops. Then 25% says using up leftovers, and only 15% thinks it's limiting water use. Let's have a look at the results. And the winner is actually your number 2. It's using up leftovers. As you see, it's most of these habits have been growing in the past 15 months. This is a combined result of 15 months later, together with living more at home for some people, confined at home, being more confronted with what's inside your fridge. Some wanted to avoid to go for the queues in supermarket and run shopping on their own with the face masks. So they were limiting the frequency of going to grocery stores and using up more what's left in the fridge. So that's definitely the number 1. It was already the number 1 last year, but it has still grown. Recycling at home, as you can see, has also been growing fast. Again, we're living more at home, so that could be COVID-19 related. And then refusing plastic bags, your number 1 is actually number 3, but it also has been growing, as you can see. And limiting water usage, it's more on number 6. You can also see COVID next to choosing holidays with train, car, or a bus instead of a plane. That could also, of course, be related to staycations and to the results of COVID-19. Using up less water, as you can see, it's also limiting water usage. It's been growing. And I think one of the reasons there, it's not related to COVID-19, but more related to dry summers that we have experienced everywhere across the world, also in Europe in the past 2 to 3 years. And these dry summers, these droughts, have inspired Procter & Gamble, for instance, in 2018 during the water crisis in Cape Town in South Africa, to introduce a new range of waterless hair care products, dry shampoos, dry conditioners, that don't need to use any drop of water at all. So it can be an inspiration also for innovation. So I'll come back to that later on. Again, looking back at the habits, you also see mending and repairing rather than replacing or buying something new. Also consuming less in general. Both have also been growing. And this means that in the fashion industry, for instance, H&M is introducing repair stations in their shops where you can go and ask the staff to repair your clothes. The whole idea of resales or re-commerce instead of e-commerce, it's growing much faster than traditional retail in the last 3 years, not only because of COVID, because e-commerce has grown, of course, as well, but also because of becoming more eco-conscious. And so sites like Vinted in Europe or ThreadUp International and Depop, they're really booming. This repurposing and re-commerce, it's also growing because certain companies like IKEA and Apple, they're actively stimulating their consumers when they buy something new to also buy back their old furniture. In the case of IKEA, they're even giving extra value if you're part of their loyalty program. If you buy something new at Apple, you will have the, as first question, get this question, do you have an old Apple product? You can still earn some money if you send it back to us. So they're installing their own recycling system, but it's also on the path of becoming circular in the end, which is both for IKEA and Apple, the end goal by 2030. And then a bit more down the list, we see that trying to eat less meat is also becoming more important as a conscious habit. So we call this chapter Meat and Greed, but written in a different way. And as you can see, almost 6 out of 10 Europeans understands that their own eating habits, it does have an influence on the environment, and actually a big influence. And we've seen already some initiatives like not eating meat for 40 days in some countries, the Catholic countries around Eastern, or using January as the month to live more healthy and not eat meat. And you can see on this website page, for instance, the impact on the environment of doing that, not only saving tons of CO2, but also nitrates in the meat industry, and saving liters of water, and of course, the life of animals as well. In our results of a study, we see that there's already 15% of Europeans that call themselves Flexitarians, and we define it as, I try to avoid to eat meat as much as possible. I'm still eating meat sometimes, but I often try to go for meat alternatives. 6% vegetarians and 4% vegans, which means a quarter of Europeans today is actually avoiding to eat meat or even fish, because there's also still pescatarians, which means that it becomes a more interesting industry for many companies, even for fast service restaurants like Burger King and McDonald's, for instance. Burger King working together with the Impossible Burger as a plant-based alternative, McDonald's with Beyond Burger. And both have seen that this has led to an increased sales because you're addressing a new segment of flexitarians or more health-minded people that would otherwise not come to your restaurant in the end. In our latest results, we see that 4 out of 10 Europeans have tried plant-based alternatives for meat and 36% for dairy. And these are again on total population, and we see that it's higher both for women, again, more concerned about health, but also for Gen Z and Gen Y, next gen, so the combination of millennials and Gen Z. Animal welfare was already mentioned as one of the important aspects, and it's not only related to the meat industry and meat alternatives, but even to fashion. And we see that an online fashion site like ASOS has already some no animal products installed in their policies. They're still selling leather, but certain certified leather, but they're not selling products that have fur, feathers, silk, bone, mohair, cashmere, or Angora wool anymore because of the animal welfare in the production of the process. And I'm a big fan of the Crown series. I'm very happy that there's a new season on Netflix, almost binge-watched the entire series. But what we see is that even the Queen is no longer wearing real fur. So she's also aware that today this is something you're not doing anymore. The next question in the poll is you have the choice between two brands in the fashion industry, but also in the sports industry. It's on one hand Adidas, on the other hand it's Gucci. And the question is, what is according to you the most sustainable fashion brands or sports brands? So you have the choice between Gucci on one hand or Adidas on the other hand. Which of both brands do you think is the most sustainable? And while you're voting, I will give you the example of how Nike is also moving to zero. That means zero emissions, zero carbon footprint, but also zero waste. And they're doing that, and you can see that on the box of shoes of Nike. As if there is a windmill on the box, it means that at least 50% of the shoe you just bought is made from recycled material, which are factory scraps, for instance, that they're reusing in this type of shoes. This is the Vapor Max 2020 Fly Night shoe, for instance. On the box, there is also a QR code. If you scan the QR code in augmented reality, actually, in mixed reality, you will see their whole sustainability strategy explained. You can explore different parts of it. For instance, the European Distribution Center, of which they will explain, and this is in Dutch, but they will explain that they're using only 5 natural energy sources: solar energy, geothermal energy, biofuel, and hydro energy, to actually decrease the CO2 emission of the distribution, also to have less waste. So you get a whole tour around their own sustainability programs when you just scan the QR code on their packaging. These are the results of what you think is the most sustainable fashion brand. So I think the majority has clearly voted for Adidas. I don't think we need to call for recounting the votes. It's a clear difference in this case, and the majority is wrong, because when we look at the corporate nights ranking of the top 100 global brands within the fashion industry, Gucci, as part of the Kering luxury group, is ranked higher than Adidas. And these were the 2020 results. We will soon have the 2021 results, and I'm sure that Adidas is moving up in the list, as they already did in the past year. They came from 84, as you can see, and are on place 55 this year. But on place 23, and they came from number 2, was Gucci. And then in between them, there's H&M. I think both H&M and Adidas will have moved up in the list. I'm not sure about Gucci. How is Corporate Knights doing this? To make this clear, you cannot make any submission to be part of this list. So what they're doing is they're using public disclosed data and reports, and then using 21 different KPIs, both on the social, environmental, and health aspects, but also on governance, on financial management, on employee management, and on the cleanliness of the revenues, with different weights in each industry to actually come up with this ranking. But as you can see, Kering and the Gucci, as part of Kering, is number 1 within the fashion industry, or at least it was at the start of 2020. And they're not often communicating about this to the end consumers, but to their stakeholders, to shareholders. If you go to the Kering corporate website, you will immediately find this page, which is all about the sustainability of Kering and Gucci. And they have the EPNL, the environmental profit and loss, taking into account throughout the entire supply chain, so also their suppliers and the suppliers of their suppliers and the customers, what the waste is, what the pollution is, what the carbon emissions are in the end. So it's because of this transparency and of this measurement of the total supply chain, which Gucci and Kering has been doing for over 10 years by now, that they're ranking that high in the scores of Corporate Knights. Coming back to the habits of our consumers, we see the lowest, the least frequently done conscious habit is actually paying to offset flights. It has grown a bit, but not so many people are having flights today, I guess. So actually, everything that has to do with paying, willingness to pay, affordability is an important barrier to living more sustainable. maybe we are not quite negative about how flights have an impact on the environment, and they have, but do know that in the meantime, there are schools and universities in Zurich in Switzerland, for instance, developing together with Lufthansa more bio-friendly kerosene or a synthetic kerosene, you could say, that is actually using CO2 emissions to create, and water and sunshine, to create a more climate-friendly fuel that is renewable, that is affordable, and that doesn't have a negative impact on the industry at all. So within a few years, and Lufthansa has an agreement with the ETH in Zurich to develop this and to use this type of fuel. Within a few years, this will become cheaper, and flying, we won't have the flight scheme or vloegskaam anymore, but it maybe will even become good for the planet to take a flight. What we see in general is that apart from affordability, convenience is the main enemy of sustainability. So remember that half of the Europeans says I'm living sustainable, which means that the other half is not. If we ask the other half why not, what are the barriers to living more sustainably, we see that it's typically related to it's too expensive, so affordability. It's too hard for me to get to more sustainable products, that's accessibility or convenience. Or I don't know which products or brands are more sustainable than others. I don't know how to live more sustainable myself. And what's the reward? What's the win-win? What's in it for me? If it's not cheaper, do I get like tax deductions? So that's also quite important as a driver. So let's first have a look at affordability. And often we think that sustainable products are more expensive. But it shouldn't always be the case, because if you can save on energy costs, if you can save on transport costs, if you can save on ingredient costs, you can actually create a product that is cheaper and more sustainable as well. And I think this Unilever example of Cif, a home care brand, is a good example. The eco refills, which are much smaller, more concentrated, you need to dilute it yourself at home, uses less plastics, 100% recyclable plastics, but also less transport, which leads to less CO2 emissions, but also lower costs for the company. So the product itself, the refill, is cheaper as the large bottle of Cif. Accessibility. If we look at this, a personal care brand like Beauty Kitchen, for instance, in the UK, has been installing refill stations, not just in grocery and retail stores, but also at university campuses, train stations, garden centers, beauty salons, and major office complexes, to get a refill station as close to consumers as possible, to make it more convenient and to get rid of this barrier to actually refill your own packaging again. Think also of the Too Good To Go app, a Danish initiative that is rolling out not only in Europe, but also now in the US and other parts of the world, that has already saved so many millions of meals, and so many Europeans that are working with this app, which indicates, and that's convenient, in your neighborhood, which restaurants and hotels have surplus foods and are offering a reduction of 35 to 70%. So it's a combination of affordability and convenience and ease, and it also still is a win-win for the restaurant and for the hotel. Instead of throwing away the food, they're still earning some money on the food. Reminding and rewarding, this is an example from a metro station in Italy, in Rome, where they have a reverse vending machine. If you put in a plastic bottle, it gives you credits on your metro card. So you're benefiting from every time you do something good for the environment. And education in general is very important. This brand, it's a personal care brand, which is all about water management, using less water in the production, not using virgin plastics. But also, as you see, the name of the brand is Stop the Water While Using Me. It is educating the consumer. It was a startup brand that was acquired by Beiersdorf, the German multinational, earlier this year. So the second part of the presentation was all about more conscious behavior, the mindset, 50% living more sustainable versus the habits, which are not always in line, with convenience being the biggest enemy of sustainability, and responsible consumption, creating that stimulating that as a brand. It's not only about what you say, but also how you say it, which means you have to stress the fact that it's not necessarily more expensive, that it is accessible, that it is easy, and it is rewarding to live more sustainable or to choose your sustainable alternative. So it's about education and reminding people. And then I come to the last chapter of the presentation, which is all about there is a good business in doing good business. If we ask Europeans, do you think sustainable brands have a higher quality? Already 42% agrees, and 55% says they are more up to date than the non-sustainable alternatives. Almost 7 out of 10 says even, I feel more positive about a company or a brand that makes efforts to reduce the carbon footprint. So again, carbon footprint, it's an important notion to take with you in this presentation. If we look at the academic results, and this is a study done by London Business School along with Harvard Business School, they compared 90 high ESG companies with 90 low ESG companies. ESG, environmental, social governance. The high ESG companies, they were implementing on average 40% of different things you can do on becoming more environmentally or socially responsible. The low ESG companies, they were implementing maximum 10% of the same lists of ESG strategies. And then they compared how did these two types of company that for the rest were controlled on market share, on industry, so 90 high, 90 low ESG companies, but identical twins for the rest. How did they perform in the past years? And they looked into the data from 1992 to 2010, so 18 years. If you have invested $1 in a high ESG company, it led to $22.6 in 2010, even after the start of the financial crisis. If you did the same in a low ESG company, implementing not so many strategies, ESG strategies in their company, it led to $15.4. So there is a shareholder benefit. And they also concluded that in 11 out of the 18 years, the high ESG companies had a better financial performance, operational every year, than the low environmental companies. So there is a business case, there is a financial case, and there's also, of course, the marketing case of using sustainability in branding. And there's 4 reasons why we should invest in more sustainable branding. The first one is it creates more awareness and more preference. Awareness, we know that there is a fragmentation of media, especially since COVID-19, people have more subscription to different streams. They started gaming more, so it became harder to get their eyeballs. And it makes sense, instead of investing money in different campaigns for different labels, sub-labels, brands, sub-brands, to invest money in one message that will resonate with your consumer and is relevant for all your products, all your brands. And then it often comes back to a sustainability message, because that is related to your production and it's an overall message. But it can also lead to a new market or a brand that is disrupting the market, to preference, for instance. Let's have a look at the chocolate market, where you probably have heard about Tony's Chocolonely. Tony's Chocolonely, it's all about slave-free, fair trade, fair wages chocolate. Even the product is designed in these different pieces that are not equally divided to literally show in the product that this is the case for other chocolate brands, but Tony's is working on this fair trade. And it is a brand that within a mature market actually was able to create preference and to create a market share. So it's a differentiator from competition for them. If we look at the Nielsen figures in the chocolate markets, we can see that although the total chocolate market is growing both in volume and in value, that it's actually the brands that have environmental claims or health claims, absence of artificial ingredients, bio-organic, or the ones like Tony Chocolonely that are working on fair trade. So for the people, those are growing 3 times, 4 times, or 2 times as fast as the rest of the chocolate market, which is still growing, and especially during a crisis, the need for chocolate is still going up. So the first benefit is clearly not only awareness, but also preference and market share. The second reason is to defend your brand image and your reputation and to still have your license to operate. Because if you're not communicating, or you're not branding on sustainability, there will be boycotts there, which, for instance, in Europe, 21% of Europeans in our study in October says we have boycotted the brand for sustainability reasons. And it's mainly next-gen consumers. If you compare it to older consumers, baby boomers, for instance, there is a clear significant difference between millennials, Gen Z, and older consumers. So the future consumer, who becomes increasingly important, is more boycotting. So you need to defend your license to operate. There's also NGOs who otherwise will do the unsustainable branding part for you. And Greenpeace is quite famous for doing this type of campaigns that always attracts press. For instance, at the headquarters of Mattel, they said Mattel, for their Barbies, they're using wood and pulp and paper coming from the rainforests, and they did this barbaric campaign at the headquarters of Mattel with a lot of cameras filming it, destroying your license to operate and your reputation. Sustainable branding can also lead to more new markets and more relevant innovations. There's this example of Arla Foods and Arla Foods ingredients that, to target the Chinese market, they created their first clean label yogurt brand, which is also ambient, which means it doesn't need to be refrigerated. You can just keep it in your closet, because that's what the Chinese customer wants, and they also want a clean label. So they created something sustainable to address a new market. And the last benefit is, of course, to engage your own employees. We know that we're in a war of talent, where both millennials and Gen Z employees, they're looking for a company that is reflecting their own values. They are looking for a company that offers a purpose and meaning in life, and it's one of the main reasons to choose their employers. And then I'm coming to the last part of the presentation, which is all about communicating. What we saw in the results of our study is that if you ask people which brands are communicating about sustainability, they often mention retailer brands, or sometimes H&M or Apple or Tesla. But in general, the knowledge of brands that communicate about sustainability is very low, because many brands are not actively communicating about sustainability yet. They're a bit afraid to do it because they think we should be 100% sustainable before we start campaigning about that. And I think that's wrong. And one reason why it's wrong is that if you do not communicate about it, that's also communication. 7 out of 10 consumers says if a brand is not talking about it, it means they're actually not doing it. So start communicating about what you're doing, because I'm sure most of you are involved with ESG strategies. And these are the 4 rules that I would like to share with you at the end of this presentation. The first one is start talking about your real commitments, because it shows you're serious about it. It's not something you do this year as your summer or winter campaign, but you have some plans. You want to reach some goals by 2021, 2023, 2025, 2030, 2040, even long term, which means it's not just a marketing campaign, it's a strategy, it's a long term. Do that in a non-boring way, because many companies are already doing it on their website. And to take a look at the right side of this slide, where Volvo is explaining that they want to reduce CO2 emissions, not only by electrification of their cars, and they have the goal of becoming climate neutral by 2040, which is still 20 years from now, so it's a long-term commitment. But by 2025, they want already 40% less CO2 emissions. You can also see to the left side that they're already campaigning with consumer campaigns in consumer media, with attractive slogans like "Volvos are rubbish." This is a campaign by Volvo, showing rubbish in a plastic bottle in the shape of a car, but also saying we aim to use at least 25% rPETs, recycled plastics, in our cars by 2025. So a long-term commitment that's important to avoid the idea it's a short-term or greenwashing campaign. Of course, you cannot only talk about the long term, you should also talk about what you have already achieved today or are achieving today. So talk about milestones. For instance, Heineken this year, after 10 years of introducing electric trucks, for instance, for city deliveries, and going for more green energy using solar power, wind power, but also the byproduct of the brewing process, biofuel, in the production of Heineken brands, This year they achieved a milestone that all of the Heineken brands, not just Heineken itself, in the Netherlands are brewed by using 100% green energy, and they did this out-of-home poster campaign stating that that is the newest ingredient of Heineken. So that is quite important. Celebrate at milestones. Always be transparent and open about commercial motives for the same reason. If you are only communicating about sustainability and don't mention you also have commercial motives, then you risk again of being attacked by consumer activists saying you're doing it to earn money, which is, for instance, something that Unilever is doing very cleverly by, for instance, 2 weeks ago, they introduced that they want to invest more in plant-based alternatives. And the first bullet point on their website, in the press release, in the communication of the CEO, is actually saying we have a target within 5 to 7 years of having 1 billion sales euros coming from plant-based meat and dairy alternatives. It's the first bullet. And then they talk about food waste, they talk about positive nutrition, lower calories, but the first bullet is clearly a commercial motive. That's important because we're still living in a post-greenwash age, which means that only 40% or 44% for the moment is trusting companies that claim sustainability, and especially Gen X and baby boomers are quite skeptical. We also see that 3/4 want brands to become more transparent and provide additional information on sustainability, and that number is also growing. So track and tracing becomes more important. And there are different eco-labels on the backside of packaging, but there's so many different eco-labels that often consumers get confused. Now, the last question I would like to ask you in your poll again is, when you're buying groceries or when consumers are buying groceries, which ingredients or which labels are checked the most on grocery packaging? And you have some different options there: the provenance of the product, the calorie counts, the carbs. Is it natural? Is there sugar inside the product? So which ingredients do consumers check the most on their packaging? That's the question in your poll everywhere too. Flipside shopping is definitely a trend. It means we are turning the package to see what are the ingredients. Are there any E numbers? Are there any names mentioned that I don't understand because they sound chemical, but maybe they're natural, but I don't understand what's inside. And we see that consumers are also actively asking for more certifications that are reliable and accessible to understand if a brand is more sustainable or not. 3/4 agree, and even 80% of baby boomers. So talking back of these baby boomers that are laggards in implementing more sustainable behavior, they have to be convinced, they're more skeptical, they're looking for certifications in the end. One other way of doing it is what Heineken has done to their own distinctive assets, which is the front side of their packaging. They were printing the ingredients that are all natural and understandable and comprehensible to mainstream consumers, to stress the fact that there is nothing artificial in a bottle of Heinz ketchup. Let's have a look at the results of what you think is checked the most on pack. And sorry, I was a bit too fast. I see most of you say calorie counts and sugar as number 2. Provenance is still growing in the results. And also the natural 10% and the amount of carbs 3%. As you can see, the graph is still evolving a bit, but I think we already have a clear winner. If you're not counting the post votes, the mail votes that are coming in a bit late, but 51% of you are mentioning calorie counts. Let's have a look at the results. So number 1 was actually sugar, and you see calorie counts, it's lower down the top, it's actually on number 6. So sugar as a number 1, sugar is still, apart from plastics, an enemy, and of course there's a link with calorie count and sugar, which is the reason why Mars, for instance, is introducing low calorie ranges and also changing the recipe of their confectionery products to have less sugar inside. The provenance is important, where the product comes from, and again, because of COVID-19, where we actually we're seeing how the supply chain got disrupted by not having ingredients coming from the East, from Asia. So it became more clear where our products are actually coming from, or the ingredients at least. So the provenance, where the products come from, it became more important. people are also more inclined to support local. That is what we call terroir-ism, not terrorism, but terroir-ism referring to the terroir of a wine. So where the product is made becomes a quality indicator, it always has, but it becomes more important, especially after COVID-19, to know where the product comes from, especially for fresh products, produce products like dairy, for instance. Friesland Campina on the Belgian website is showing that these are Belgian cows that produce your milk. On the Dutch website, they talk about Dutch families that are producing the milk. And it's not only in produce, but also in other categories, it becomes more important. And it can be a competitive differentiator. For instance, this is from the source, van de bron.nl in the Netherlands. And they're offering surplus energy of farms, for instance, that have their own windmills. And you're actually buying directly your energy from the source, van de bron.nl, from a certain family. So you see the pictures of the family, you see where they're producing the energy. So it's clear that it's green energy, it's not gray energy, making the provenance, the origin of the product more important. And then the last thing I want to stress is keep your brand's tone of voice when communicating about sustainability. Too often I see that when a company or brand starts communicating on sustainability, it's the CEO talking, or it's a press release, it's the corporate press department, PR department that is taking over, and it's not the marketers anymore, which gives several messages already to your own employees. It says like, oh, this is not our normal operational marketing, it's PR, but also to your customers. They don't recognize your normal style of your brand, your normal channels and brand tone of voice. So they don't see it as part of your core strategy, which might lead to a risk of being seen as it's just PR, it's greenwashing even, and we don't want that. So try to keep your brand's tone of voice also when you communicate about sustainability in a non-boring way. And the last example that I want to show before we go into the Q&A is this of Absolut, part of the Pernod Ricard group, Absolut Vodka in Sweden. They have this induction movie they show to every new employee that starts working for Absolut. And part of it is really about the sustainability, and they do it in this way.
Our production process is CO2 neutral, and we don't like to waste a thing. That's why our excess tillage is used to feed local pigs and cows every day, like they feel. But the most important ingredient that goes into Absolut is our people. So you see, every single drop that goes into every single bottle of Absolut vodka anywhere in the world comes from here in Åhus. And that's why we're the vodka with nothing to hide. Welcome to Absolut.
So this is part of the movie. Look it up on YouTube. The people you saw were actually all 28 of them are employees working in the Aarhus factory, but also in marketing. There is the CEO, there's a VP marketing, the head of PR, the CMO is there. So very transparent, you could say, and talking in a non-boring way in their own tone of voice of Absolut. So this last part was all about it's good business to do good business. We talked about the 4 rules of communicating on sustainability, and remember that not communicating also is saying something, namely that you're not sustainable. And there is 4 reasons and a business case of sustainable branding. So we shouldn't just do it because we don't want to make Greta angry or the rest of Generation Z, but because there is good business in doing good business. Thanks so much for your attention.